The third of these rewards for reaching an inspired life is that your consciousness expands in every direction. What does this mean? Your consciousness expands in every direction. It means there's no up and there's no down. It means there's no right and there's no wrong. It means that there's no north and there's no south. It means that there's no beginning and no end. You begin to move into a consciousness place within yourself that you'll find yourself, when you move into spirit, you're going to find yourself doing things that you don't understand why you're doing them. In 1994, when Immaculée was imprisoned in this tiny little bathroom with 7 other people with no facilities, she did something that I found so astounding when I first met her, when she came to a lecture I had given in New York. And I was so taken by her. She didn't come to me and say, "Will you help me?" I sought her out and said, "How may I be of service to telling your story in a profound way?" And what she did when she entered that bathroom is she asked the pastor whose home she was in, "Do you have an English and a French dictionary?" And she learned English while she was being hunted to be killed. For what reason? Why would someone who is in that kind of a state practice, day in and day out, up to 8-10 hours, and she couldn't speak. They didn't speak for 91 days. No sound whatsoever. So, 5 years later, she is a survivor. She represents less than 0.5% of the Tutsi women of Rwanda who survived. All the rest were killed. She went into a place within herself and taught herself a language that she was going to need 5 years from now. That's what I mean by your consciousness expands in every direction. And then 5 years later, in 1999 or 2000, she had when she was here in America and on an asylum visa, married, living out on Long Island, has 2 children, is assimilated into our culture, is a great spokesperson for transcending hatred on the planet. She woke every day, 3 o'clock in the morning, before she went to work at the UN, and wrote every little detail of what happened in those 91 days. 150,000 words. She wrote and gave that to me 5 years after that. And I said, "Immaculée, it's wonderful, but your native language is Kinyarwanda, your second language is French, your third language," so we got help in helping her to convert it into language that would be. But how did she know in 1994 that she was going to be in America and coming up on a stage like this and talking to our country in a language that is her third language? How did she know that? Your consciousness expands in every direction. When you have an inkling, when you have, like Ryan, when you have a feeling within you that this is something that you have to do, that you can't be stopped from doing it, the whole world changes. And you start and you listen to it. And you find yourself, if someone hands you a book, and then someone else talks about that book, and then someone else mentions it, and then you see the author on television, and all of a sudden you start saying, "Wait a minute, I've got to listen to this. I am being directed. I'm being called. I trust in this. I totally, completely trust." Your consciousness expands in every direction when you enter the world of spirit. And you get yourself pulled in these directions, and you allow yourself to be pulled in that way. That's what I mean by your consciousness expands in every direction. Nothing is impossible. And whatever you find yourself doing, that's what you allow yourself to do and what you allow yourself to be. There's a great quote by Rumi. He's just one of the greatest. Every tree and plant in the meadow seemed to be dancing. Those which average eyes would see as fixed and still. That's what happens when your consciousness expands in every direction. You see, you understand the Tao. The Tao is like it's the silence between the notes that makes the music. It's the space between the bars that holds the tiger. You're a sculptor and you sculpt yourself a vase. And what do you think makes the vase? What makes the vase is not the tile, and it's not the substance of the material. It's the inner space within there that is surrounding it. Without that inner space within, there can be no vase. And without that inner space within you, there's no you. You're not skin and bone and all that. That encapsulates an inner silence, an inner place that is totally and completely yours, uniquely yours. Your consciousness expands in every direction. When you do, you start practicing things like kindness, where judgment was before. I've often said that when you have a choice to be right or to be kind, just pick kind. Why? Because it's more closely aligned with your spirit. You begin to exude something called love. You feel it for everyone. Believe it or not, at the end of Immaculate's book, she goes to the prison where the people who were her killers, one was her mathematics teacher. And what happens is that you begin to embrace a kind of love even for the people who would do such harm to you. And I'm telling you, that's what saved her. You'll see that when you read it. That's what saved her. The ability to go to that place within, that place of forgiveness. As Mark Twain said, forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. Powerful thinking. You become an instrument of truth. You become someone who listens. You become someone who is God realized. Okay? Your consciousness expands in every direction. I want to tell you something that I think will be very, very helpful to you. I want you to think about the troublemakers in your life. I want you to think about the troubled ones in your life. I want you to think about the ones in your life that are hooked on drugs. I want you to think about the ones who don't cooperate, the ones who don't fit in, the ones who perhaps are disrespectful, use language that you don't approve of, use substances that you find difficult, people that perhaps you work at. But mostly, I want you to think about people like that in your family. Now, I know that you think it's always somebody else, but they're thinking of you. And I want to tell you about how consciousness expands in every direction when you take these people who are your greatest teachers, the people who have come into your life to teach you how to love them through what it is that they're struggling with, what it is that they are going through. And it's just, there's a need there. A need to be loved, that it's very difficult to love certain people under certain circumstances in certain ways, particularly when they behave in ways that are so troublesome to you. And I want to take you back in my own family, and I've been given permission to do this. One of my children who got herself into that kind of a state as a teenager and struggled with her own self and her own addictions and her own fears. And the process over a longer period of time, I called together a family meeting. And I put everybody in the family together, and I had everybody in the family tell her how her behavior was affecting everyone else. And each person went through and talked about how difficult it was. I went through and talked about how I couldn't sleep, and it was her mom told her about how worried she was and how scared she was and how upset she was. And we went through this whole thing with this wonderful, beautiful child. And that night she went out and behaved in the same ways that she'd been behaving all along. Almost as if to say, I just don't need to hear how bad I am any longer. And I want to tell you something that I learned since then. I've talked to my daughter about this, and today she's this soul who devotes a big part of her life to helping people who were as troubled as she was at one time. Divinely beautiful, beautiful young lady. I want to tell you about a woman, her name was Peace Pilgrim. Peace Pilgrim was a woman, an elderly woman who walked around the country, and all she did, dressed in white, was go into different communities and she would just talk about peace. That's all she did. She talked peace wherever she went. And in the process of talking peace, there would be no ads, and no one knew her name. She was just called Peace Pilgrim. I believe there's a website about Peace Pilgrim today. And I was in touch with Peace Pilgrim, and then it turns out that she had read some of my books and we had communicated, and then one day she was walking along the highway to another town and she was killed by a car that didn't see her. It was an accident and she died.